Okay, welcome back to another episode of Habits of Character as we start to delve into this. Now, there's a lot of channels that will give you a lot of great things for just habit training and making those shifts of focus. I want to help you work through those ideas as well, but more importantly, I kind of want to give you a framework so as to how to work through how you develop as a person, how we develop as people, because we can borrow and should learn from the habits of others, but we're also going to find that a lot of the motivation and the hype speak and the things that we perhaps aspire to, the examples that we want, aren't necessarily going to integrate smoothly into our life. We're going to have setbacks, we're going to have troubles or discouragements. We're going to, at times, find ourselves falling back into old habits. And that kind of brings me to where I want to start with today. And what I want to talk about is this idea of perspective, because how we see things and how we interpret the world and our experience of the world and life gives us both a great power, but also can put us at a struggle to be able to shift our gear, because we can become very trapped in a very narrow field of vision. And perspective is a big part of everything, including how we interpret life, our experience of life, and ourselves and our identity. It forms something we call our worldview, which tends to become a self-referential, reinforcing construct, which is very deeply interconnected into our identity. How we see the world and our place within it is going to be led very largely by a confirmation bias, whether conscious or not, as we both consciously and unconsciously develop a sense of self and develop our sense of how the world works, its perceived laws or operations. So I bring a cute little prop with me, something I've had for many, many years. It's a little glasses cleaner. And it says, "You can't be optimistic with a Misty Optic." And I think that's incredibly apt, because how you perceive yourself and how you perceive the world and your relationship to the world and life can be both affirming and discouraging at times based on the same perspective. And so our ability to disengage with that perspective, to detach from concepts of ourself even, allows us room to grow, to reconsider and reconceive, and to challenge things, and to help us make transitions in life and face transitions in life. We often find crisis and hardship and pain and suffering comes from a forceful and often unexpected or unwelcome transition that we engage with and experience in life. Because life happens, as Henry Rollins says, life is happening all the time. It happened before us, it's going to happen after us. We're just happening in life. And our life and our perception can become incredibly fishbowl and distorted based on the fact that we can only really experience and confirm our story of it. And we are a very narrative type of animal. So our ability to become more self-aware and aware of our perspective helps us navigate and consciously choose these transitions and how we're going to engage with them, to define meaning out of them, to define purpose and define identity within them. So we do need to take on some certain skills, a degree of detachment, to reflect and review our experiences, to disengage from our understanding of things at times, so that we can look at it from a broader picture beyond our own view. Now, Don Miguel Ruiz gave us a beautiful example of a cinema or multiple theaters where we're able to sit and observe a viewing. And what we find in that viewing, when we start watching it, is a scene, perhaps a story from our life. And we see it from our experience, we see it from our perspective. All the players have the faces of the people we know and love and cherish. And the story confirms. But after a while we get curious and perhaps we enter another showing. And it's the same story and the same faces, but the actors are slightly different now. We see it from perhaps the perspective of another loved one, perhaps your mother or your father or sibling or your partner. And the character that is you, the actor playing that face, is perhaps behaving in a way that you don't necessarily identify with. That perhaps there are tones and dismissive behavior or attitudes that we would not naturally agree to ourselves, and that perhaps how that person whose story it is, whose perspective it is, we don't find entirely agreeable. But there's a grain of truth in it, and a discomfort. And as we view and enter the different theaters, the different showings, and become more aware, we see some consistencies, but we see many many differences and conflicts and challenging things. And it's to understand that there is a truth and a lie, not a malicious lie, but a narrative that enters each perspective that is an interpretation of that truth. And when we understand that that is true of all of us, we can begin to offer a bit of generosity to that interpretation, as well as a bit of criticism to it and our own. And that healthy criticism of our own is something that we can affect. Chasing and challenging the behaviors of others will often be met with challenge. It can be done lovingly and respectfully. And there is a place for that. We're talking about boundaries and growth and how we approach that. But right now, what is within our control is with ourselves. And so it is essential that we begin by practicing these things with ourselves. Now, your perspective, or how you view the world, is made up by a framework of what we call your worldview. And your worldview is constructed by multiple components that relate very deeply to your identity and to your experience of life and the identity groups that you belong to. So factors such as the culture or community to which you belong or perceive yourself to belong to, friendship circles, family, your generation, boomer, millennial, Gen X, whatever title you give or whatever, like your peerage. It also tends to connect to religious groups or non-religious groups, depending on those that you find affinity with. There will be shared values, there will be shared experiences. We all have an experience of the spicy cough. It's a shared narrative, it's a shared experience. However, there are individualized and group interpretations of it. Those that, see it as just a passage, those that saw it as an imposition. These all give us a sight of belonging or a sight of difference. And sometimes we'll find, and probably found during those periods, conflict would arise because not all of your framework may necessarily be congruent, that they all follow the same experience or interpretation of events, that they have the same value system entirely. And sometimes your value system may conflict as you have two different sites of belonging, sites of identity that may come into conflict. So you may find that certain family values conflict with your generational values and experience. That all of these narratives are, by and large, congruent and unthought about, seem to fit together very nicely, but at times will come into conflict, that perhaps interpretations such as attraction and belonging may differ with cultural or belief and belief systems, and cause a conflict in identity. A conflict of experience may come in too, where you find yourself navigating something and challenged by your relationship to that experience compared to the narrative or interpretation that is given by others. Now, these can be quite stressful and painful periods of transition and growth. They can be met with a more negative interpretation and be considered triggering to perhaps traumatic, or they can be seen as growth and opportunity. And that aligns from your perspective, the amount of resources and resilience so that you can apply to it, as you can connect it to a sense of your life story, the perspective of how you're building your experience and engaging with your experience of your life. And so, yes, this is a little bit philosophical, but that's because I would like us to be able to have the appropriate language and understanding, so that when you meet a hardship, when you are faced with a point of transition in your life, that rather than being a reactive thing, that you are unexpectedly thrown into this need, that you can consciously engage with your perspective, that you can take a degree of play and whimsy in your life, even, and trust me, even when it's painful, that you can take a degree of curiosity. And curiosity to self, the experience, and those engaging in that experience with you. And not be so married to your own perspective that you can't perhaps view it from different angles, different lenses, to see what needs to be addressed, what does not, where meaning can be found, where integration into your understanding, your worldview, and your perspective exists, and where perhaps your perspective limits your capacity to grow. Now, to use the right kind of language, I guess, it's like to develop that level of conscious cognitive thing, to move from a very strict and structured interpretation of what can be called the Newtonian world, or a completely, absolute and rational thing. We can start by breaking one thing very quickly. The world, as we understand it, cannot operate in an absolute. To take a very hard, rational being like a scientific interpretation, or, I don't want to challenge or slam groups by being like, a very atheist thing. If you hold it up to a cold light, you're still going to be struggling with the limitations of your ability to answer the more existential questions, the meaning of life, determining that there is meaning in life. Because to be incredibly rationalistic, everything's just a series of chemical reactions and atomic movement. It's light, matter, particles, blah, blah. That's not going to help you answer grief. That's not going to help you navigate the emotional reality just by saying it's hormones or chemicals. Yes, there is a lot of truth in the fact that we can understand that your neural pathways will develop and follow thoughts. So taking your perspective, taking your reflection and writing down what you think, what you find loops in your brain, you'll realize the roads that consciously or not that you are traveling frequently, because the more those thoughts occur or reoccur without being addressed, the more unconsciously you allow them to rule, the more developed that thought pattern becomes. So you can unintentionally turn a dirt track of thought, a random reaction of emotion and intensity, and develop it into a 6-lane freeway with, no speed limits and heavy traffic, because it is continuously being fed and being affirmed without being challenged, without being engaged with. What we might call, beautifully, what's been called the Weltbild in German, I like it, it's a fun word, Weltbild, is a picture of the world. So, oh, these evil rich people are at the top of the world and they control everything, and I'm just a victim struggling to get by. Da, 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 da. Such is life. This is the way it is. I have my good days. I have my very passive engagement. It's not a bad thing. But you have no control over it. You can't shift and engage with that perspective too deeply until you pull it into a deeper ownership, until you pull it out of that Newtonian world of these are the things that happen to me, and you develop what they call the Weltschlag. Weltschlag is a way of looking at living in the world, seeing and perceiving, where we have to become reflective and know to detach, to exchange and challenge our worldview. And you'll experience this with those existential questions. What is the meaning of life? What is afterlife? Where is meaning in grief and loss? And a beautiful interpretation of loss or grief, heartbreak, and all these things is to understand that that is a change or a transition unwanted, unsought for. You did not actively go engage with that. It wasn't like, well, I went to win the marathon. It is something has been subtracted from my interpretation of life, and I do not know how to reconstruct or to construct a new one just yet. The ability to practice reflection, to write down our experience, and I definitely encourage writing in this stuff. Journaling is a wonderful thing. It's going to help you clean the lens of your Misty Optic, because you'll start to see how much of it is a narrative. We have a habit of putting our story and our experience into a narrative. This thing happened, then this person did this. And we can assign an intent to it based on our reception. Whether that intent was there or not, maybe it was telegraphed for you, in which case you're alleviated of uncertainty, but maybe the uncertainty is where you're filling in your gaps. And so knowing to engage with it, write it down, and then question it, doubt it. What is even if they said that, what is the value of that to me? How does that engage with me? Maybe it educates me on that person a bit better. My curiosity is now piqued as to why that is their value system. And writing down our own values, like anything that elicits a strong emotional reaction is often a call to your values. Either it is something that you perhaps relate to a little too well, an honesty or a dishonesty. You don't like it because, you see someone perhaps being incredibly lazy and disingenuous with their behavior. And your repulsion to that behavior is actually a discomfort within yourself and a tendency to do those things in hardship too. Perhaps it's an opposite, because you have had to fight so hard to overcome these things. You have such a strong value placed in productivity, structure, response, resilience, that you are called to these things. These give you a reflection, not because they're necessarily the truth of what your interpretation is, but the fact that you're interpreting it through that lens. The more clearly you can articulate your values, your beliefs, your worldview, your identity, the more ability you have to control it, recognize it, and allow it to grow and shift as it needs to, because sometimes these things stop serving you. Sometimes the things that we believe aren't entirely healthy because they are built of a framework of things that we need to become conscious of to see whether or not they're limiting us or growing us. That the way in which we view the world and relate to the world may not be the best one. If you believe that everything is beyond your control and out of your control, then where's your ability to have change and engagement? If you believe in some sort of predeterminism, it's very comfortable. Now you don't have to really decide anything. My lot is hard, my lot is great. You're free from the responsibility of doing anything about anything. And it's kind of a shallow place to sit. It doesn't give you much. And life's a little too short for that, just to ride the ride. Not when you can engage with it and shift with it, which I don't think most of us really want to do. Like, we don't want to just sit there when we have the ability to feel a call to action, a call to adventure. So understanding yourself and your ability to grow. Because here's the challenging part. In order to grow, in order to develop and transform, things will need to die in you. Things will need to be mourned and lost and cut away in how you see yourself and the world, because they don't serve you, and it will hurt. If it's done right or wrong, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt to let go of things that you considered so essential to yourself and your life, but that you realize are holding you back, or that are just no longer beyond your control or not within your control. Control is a beautiful lie. We tell ourselves we cling to control because we want the safety of consistency. But the only thing we can control is our response to things and our understanding of things, our perspective, our worldview, and our identity. And it begins by becoming conscious of our thoughts, being able to question and detach from them, to question our perspective and our thoughts. Marcus Aurelius said beautifully, the things you think about determine the quality of your mind. Your soul takes on the color of your thoughts. So that narrative, that perspective that you operate from, that place of belonging, that interpretation, that your interpretation of yourself and your experience of the world are so deeply entrenched and reaffirming. These things always happen to me. Or, if only I could change this, if only I could do this. This is storytelling. This is thinking, not feeling, and it may evoke an emotion. You know it's an emotion when it's one word, when you can define it in one word, and you might need the wheel of emotions to do that. Grief is an emotion. Fear of abandonment, not an emotion, it's a thought, which means it's storytelling. Which is a wonderful thing, because now you understand a degree of your story. Feeling betrayed, yes. There's a feeling there. However, think about it. Because something elicited, something pricked it, you'll find that there's a story. A call to action, a challenge, the ability to overcome the thoughts. You'll find storytelling will take over your emotions, and your emotions will be elicited by the narrative, the thought. And so it's good to become conscious of them. Now, an idea I wanted to say earlier and mentioned in the first video, and we'll come back to, is this idea of that personal integrity. The ability to move from the Weltbild to the Weltanschauung, to move into a deeper philosophical understanding of self, a more questioning interpretation of self, the ability to open up that growth, that little bit of plasticity and play. that's where you're going to be able to take some habits, because you're no longer going to be trapped in the story of self that you've had, the story of how life is. You're going to start to write a story. You're going to start to choose interpretations and habits and behaviors. And a habit is a set of behaviors repeated. It becomes a pattern. And it is a consistency that you can create, not because you're not going to miss steps, but because you can create it, because it's important to understand this. That's why certain cultures and religions put a greater focus on behavior and regulating behavior rather than expressing and communicating points of view when developing a value system. Because your behavior will tend to show your values a lot more clearly than your words or your view of things. Because your behavior will be reduced to a very simple feeding a response. It will be very desire-based. It will be very simplistic. So it can betray you, and it can be those negative behaviors that you want, those bad habits that we have, like the ability to be lazy, to procrastinate, to put things off, to avoid discomfort. Because it tells you something. Until you replace it with a new behavior. And if you have a discipline and an external criteria on that behavior, it tends to help a little bit more too sometimes. One of those things about worldview, as we know that the incredibly absolute and the rational is also limited, so is that postmodernistic interpretation of like relativism, where, if my perspective's a little bit true and a little bit flawed, and my interpretation of myself, my identity is a little bit true and a little bit flawed, and it's all good, it's all easy, and we can be very easygoing and passive that way. And I'm going to be really kind when I say, I get it. It's a lot less uncomfortable. It can be a lot easier to be forgiving. It's the same reason why we tend to keep gentle voices around us about certain things, If I don't criticize that person too harshly or challenge them too firmly on behaviors and choices, they won't do the same to me, right? Like, they won't hold me accountable. They'll be a bit forgiving on my faux pas. But that's not an area for growth. That's an area for comfort. Growth is uncomfortable. Growing yourself, developing character is going to be uncomfortable again. Things will need to die to make space for something new. And you'll know when you're being comfortable, and you know when your habits are about seeking comfort. When you look at them and you reflect on them. Whenever you're looking at a habit, especially one that you find undesirable but hard to kick, what is the need that it's trying to answer? Is it seeking comfort? What does that comfort need? What is it trying to soothe? Because it's a self-soothing mechanism. Your habits will be self-soothing mechanisms. You will reach for these things. You will repeat these things because they're predictable. They may not even be the most rewarding answer to the need, but they're an attempt to answer the need that is controllable, predictable, and consistent. And that's why you need to challenge them, because it's like reaching for a drink. Maybe a drink is something that gives you a sense of confidence and courage, or perhaps it helps you regulate difficult emotions or intense periods of overthinking, overwhelm, and overfunctioning, where we are rapidly trying to respond with a sense of urgency, and we can find that we self-regulate with these things. This is a common behavior. So look at the behavior, that desire to pour the extra drink because it feels a bit good, or to light the cigarette to seek the validation appeal in somebody else. And then look at the experience of it. I reach for this because it's comforting and allows me to feel like this. Because I need to feel like whatever. I need to feel appreciated. I need to feel relaxed when I'm overwhelmed. I need to be able to stop myself from being overwhelmed, being too much. So I know my need. Now I look at my experience of it. the alcohol makes me a little less regulated. Sometimes I have a really bad time with it. Like, I get more emotional. The cigarette break makes me more anxious. The procrastination makes me more anxious because I'm avoiding something that is now feeling more time sensitive, more urgent, more things are escalating in my head. The distraction of the show is, the TV, the doom scrolling is now making my brain feel busier, not quieter and calmer. So here's our behaviors. Here's how they're not necessarily meeting our needs, and here's the core need behind them. Now we have a measure of how we can truly answer and change those habits. And that's where your behavior becomes important. There's a really important quote that I'm going to give you, and I apologize because I'm going to have to read this one properly. But this is from a beautiful author called John Volk on worldview. And he says that people embrace what they worship more in terms of their behaviors and actions than in terms of their espoused beliefs and doctrines, because their worldview speaks or appeals to them and responds to their desires, innate or otherwise. So we will have a set of values that will have social traction, our perspective or our worldview that buys in to keep social cohesion, belonging. But then we'll have behavior that may perhaps be incongruent with it, because we might be like, I'm an incredibly moral person. I wouldn't do anything that would degrade or debase another human being. I have the utmost respect for, whatever. And then you find yourself responding to a base habit or desire because it satisfies something very core and base in you. This is what we talk about with that being not being in integrity with ourselves, that your behavior may demonstrate a value that is not true. Everyone will have a higher sense of something, perhaps, or higher articulated value in something than they actually do. The little beautiful, sweet little lies we tell ourselves. And in becoming aware of that, it allows us to really think about the hierarchy. Like, do you have a higher social value in inclusivity and, social progress, but then also heavily financially ascribed to, mine first before everyone else, that I'm happy to be equals as long as I'm growing my abundance and I'm highly able to do all the things that I want to do. Do I think I'm very disciplined when I also actively struggle to self-regulate my emotions or certain impulses? This is not to demean or degrade all of us, because we all have these incongruences in our values, our worldview, and our perspective and identity. Our ability to start to become aware of them helps us to sculpt them to become someone that has a higher alignment and congruence in what we believe and practice, that we can choose consciously to address our thinking, be conscious of our thinking and our behavior, and create patterns that answer our needs in a fulfilling and meaningful way. And that's where we want to be. We want to feel fulfilled. We want to have a sense of meaning, because meaning and purpose will drive our ability to have a resilience to change and transition and to handle setbacks without falling into or developing patterns of negative self-talk, that we will be able to realign to growth and to find consolation instead of desolation when there is discouragement and adversity, that we will be able to detach and consider and perceive things to find meaning. So this is a lot in terms of that perspective of why we need to understand this stuff, because the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we let filter through our brains will determine a degree of reaction. We will have a confirmation bias that when something happens to us that is beyond our control, that it can only be perceived from so many places. But if we just step outside, just step to the side of where we're looking, perhaps there's a more generous, more useful way to perceive this. Perhaps there is a way in which our story isn't going to disempower us, but that we can see a clear course of action and response, a degree of agency that we want, because we're not going to be able to control life and the world and others. We don't want to. Not if we actually really want to enjoy our experience. We don't want to control them. We're going to open ourselves up to letting go a bit of that control and being uncomfortable. But what we can do is control our ability to receive things, to process the story that we're going to tell about the experience, and the meaning that we can draw from it, the identity of how we attach to it. Because we don't want to just be passengers. We don't want to be victimizing ourselves by our interpretation and the story that we play over and over in our head, further than perhaps an experience may cause us to be victimized. We want to be able to draw answers and be in control of how we understand and perceive ourselves and the identity that we're shaping. We don't want to write a bad story about ourselves, because we don't want to have to live through that, right? You don't want to live through a version of yourself that is disappointing and sucks. If you find that you do not like the version of yourself that you have, change it. Begin to acknowledge and write down all of those things. Do not discredit them. Do not excuse them. Write them down. But what were they an attempt to answer? Where did they belong? And what could perhaps be something to practice in its place? We're going to develop habits that we like, to develop patterns of thinking and behaviors that align with the highest value version of ourselves. We're going to grow, and we're going to have to let go of things to do that. But in time, some of those transitions, though painful, can make space, regardless of how they came about, can make space for the growth of something good. And we want to grow something good within ourselves. We want to be able to let go of the things that hurt us, no matter how deeply connected we are to that as a behavior or something that we draw comfort from. If there is a better manifestation of that behavior, a better manifestation of that identity in self, and I'm being very conscious about the use of the word manifesting. I'm not going to go all tinfoil hat on you. But recognize the limits of trying to be too relative and being too forgiving that everyone's got their own thing and it's all okay. Or too absolute, there's only one way that this thing can go. You know, the world is only, as, science explains it or whatever, because you're going to limit yourself. You're going to devalue the range of experience that you have and you can grow in. It's a segue, but the simple one is that if we took human rights, bear with me, if we took human rights as an absolute, that every human right was absolutely necessary, unequivocal, unwavering, especially without attaching to the duty to protect them, because every right has a responsibility connected. They're intermeshed. You should never separate the responsibility to uphold a right with the idea of a right. But we know that they don't all equal. freedom of movement, the right to property, even freedom of speech, which is an incredibly integral right, they do have some limitation. To allow the free movement of somebody who is not able to follow social conventions endangers the lives of those that do. You let a violent criminal walk through society, you have destroyed the right to security and safety, the right to peace, probably the right to life at some point. So a degree of security is necessary for freedom of movement. So it kind of moves up the ranks a little bit, and the right to life is necessary for all of them. There's no point having a freedom of speech if you don't have a right to life. So your ability to uphold freedom of speech is also dependent on your ability and willingness to uphold the right to life. If you can't protect life, then you can't protect free speech. You can't protect freedom of movement. I'm not to say that we should censor or curtail free speech, but we need to acknowledge that we must protect certain rights more determinate, with more passion, more vigor, and more willing to sacrifice than others, so that we can protect those ones. So the same truth becomes essential with understanding our identity. There is a degree of the spiritual and the existential that we will engage with. Otherwise, you cannot have the joys of love, loss. And I hope you understand that loss can be a joy too, because how sweet it is that we can grieve so much, that we can love so deeply, because they pour from the same cup. You can't grieve something if you didn't love it, as painful as that is. To be able to love something is to risk the grief of losing it. It's a painful truth. If everything's relative, and there's no higher value, there's no higher truth. And as they joke, cannibalism's just a matter of epicure. If you place yourself as the seat of all truth and reality, that your interpretation and perspective is absolute, you will also devalue it deeply. There must be something higher than us, otherwise we become animalistic, ultimately, in the pursuit of our desires and gratification and comfort. It doesn't inspire higher nobility, because if I'm the seat of what's right and wrong, if my heart and my mind is the greatest measure of truth, I will find an excuse for when to bend the truth, when to withhold the truth. Because there's a big difference, right? Like, we play these games all the time, splitting hairs. We say, I'm a truthful person, but then maybe you don't outright lie. You don't tell people fabrications of things but motivated by the same thing for preferential interpretation and being received the right way, to be gaining a power in a circumstance, to not lose face. You will withhold truth. You will avoid sharing unfavorable truths or realities or interpretations of themselves. You'll be very protective of those things that may cast you in a bad light. The Stoics didn't believe in too much in the way of middle grounds. Good faith and religion doesn't either, and I don't think you should either. You know when you're not telling the truth. You know when you're avoiding the truth, that a self-protection is there to keep you from too much discomfort. that's a behavior that doesn't align with the value, and it will limit your growth. So you need to consider, is it time to outgrow that behavior? To develop some integrity in the fact that your actions and your words align. Not that you're going to water down your words and be like, I'm kind of an alright guy. I'm a good enough guy. I'm going to be a nice guy instead of a good guy. Because to be nice is okay for a little while, but you're going to lose a lot of things regardless. You know? Depending on your interpretation, you know, don't take it too personal, people, but I always say it's like pretty much the only thing that appeals to everyone is white bread, except for celiacs, of course. But you know, it's like one of those things, the things that appeal to everyone tend to have the least flavor, the least development, the least character. If you roast coffee, you know, or you like a good coffee, you like good food, it's the things with the least seasoning, the least effort, that tend to have a broad appeal, and they don't tend to be very satisfying. They tend to be forgettable. That's the same with character and integrity. The greater character, the greater integrity you develop within your character, the greater your habits, your behaviors align, and the greater discipline you have on the thoughts to keep you in line to that growth. Yeah, you're going to have conflict. Yeah, you're going to have challenges. Yeah, you're going to have bad days. But you'll understand where you stand with them. And you'll have worked for them and earned them. So we need to make a practice of moving from being a passive passenger in the story of our life to being conscious of the perspective we have on our life and the identity that we take in that life, to start to challenge it, to recognize the limitation, to look at alternatives that are favorable, give greater room for growth, and patterns of behavior that perhaps answer core needs, that aren't reductive and deductive and taking away from ourselves and others in order to fulfill them. We want to enrich ourselves, to grow. You don't want to just survive life. When you're surviving something and everything is just manageable, there's very little room for growth and thriving there. And it's not a pleasant way to get through life. So you want to step back and clear the lens. You don't want to have a Misty Optic. You don't want to think that that's the only way to see the world. So reflect. If that's your life story up to now, do you want it to continue? If you found yourself just washed down the river, and this is where you've washed up, is this actually where you're meant to be? Or do you want to have some agency and start kicking and paddling and get back in there? Learn to detach and step back from how you view even yourself. Be open to the criticisms and disappointments that people will have of you as a call to growth for the greater sense of you. Be aware of the inconsistencies between your behavior and your habits and the words you speak. Allow those people that you trust, that have earned your trust, that speak well and know you, to tell you those things. Be curious about them and look at them yourself. Reflect. Be intentional with the end of your day and reflect on your day and how you lived it and whether or not that was actually how you wanted it to be. We're just killing time. Because this is all your ability to then step back from your perspective, look at the framework that you're consistently confirming and see whether it's serving you, that those things that you think you belong to, do they line up? Do they have the greatest of integrity of value? Or are there areas where they come into conflict that you are this and you are this, but only if you kind of look at it the right way and if you don't bring certain topics into it. That this part of my life has to stay outside of this part of my life, otherwise they don't really fit well together. I'm an amicable and disorder about a person. You can't be that. Don't sit on the fence. Don't avoid the discomfort. Look at why it exists. And look at the highest possible version of yourself in it. So make a practice. When you see a habit or repetition of thought, make space to be uncomfortable and listen to it. Look at it, acknowledge it. Don't fight it. Don't immediately correct it if it's bad, but look at why it exists. Don't let it rule you. And look at what it is that it's trying to tell you. What is it a messenger for? What is the need that's trying to be expressed, or the unmet need that hasn't been heard? Listen to it yourself. And try to think what a healthy expression of that would look like. Try to find out if you're saying to yourself, I'm not enough. Enough for who? If it's an external person that you don't feel like you're good enough for, you're not going to win that. Because it's not holding either of you in the best light or the truest light. So start by being enough for yourself. What is it that you're not giving yourself? What within your perspective are you not seeing that you are blindsiding yourself from? Take some curiosity to it. Do some digging. Because curiosity is going to help you so much more than judgment and a quick read story or a bad narrative in your head. A thought pattern that keeps you up at night or creeps into your dreams. Begin to look at the story of your experience of things. Is that the truest interpretation of the experience? Or is there some limits and cracks in it, places where it could be wrong? Are there places where you can draw a mastery of self by changing the story a bit? By changing your interpretation of yourself, even if it was a dreadful experience you had. It was past tense now. You're reliving it every time you think about it, every time you visit these places. Your thoughts are relived past, they're not present. Present is what you are now experiencing. It's driven by your senses and engaging with your values, your worldview, your perspective, and the stories that you're telling yourself about who you are. You're siphoning what you can of the experience to confirm your reality and your identity and your perspective. So it's already limited, which means don't get too attached to it. Be mindful and begin to choose how you view the world. And have a little doubt, have a little curiosity as to how else it may be perceived. Because through seeing and knowing, we can start to determine what being should be. And then we can work towards integrating a better version of being that reaches a higher value and a higher level. It becomes of greater service. So there's a beginning thought, but it's worth considering. How we perceive is only the beginning. But it gives us so much power when we start to own it. we do it consciously, from deep, deep understanding and practice. We don't allow it to be the passive, the world's within. We want to be able to control it, to touch it, to twist it and turn it, so that we knowingly can find our blind spots and our limitations to grow, to be a better self. On that thought, have a good day or a good night, and reflect and detach, because we never saw the full picture.